Welcome to the second of our Artist to Artist and Conversation events at this year's Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival. My name is Graham Mackenzie and I'm the director of the festival. And I'm joined today by George E. Lewis. George is an American composer, trombone player, improviser, a pioneer of computer music, acclaimed writer, and a scholar in the fields of improvisation and experimental music. George is a professor of American music, composition, and historical musicology at Columbia University in New York, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Walker Fellowship, and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts.
Graham, that's great, but you forgot about the British Academy, man. That's the
British Academy as well, George.
You got to put that one in there. That's like, I love the British Academy. Sorry for interrupting. You can...
Absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. George has been a member of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians since 1971, and he studied composition with the great Muhal Richard Abrams. 2008, he published A Power Stronger Than Itself, the AACM and American Experimental Music. And in 2015, his opera, Afterward, based on parts of that book, was premiered in the United States and in the UK at Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival. George, I could go on, and you're quite right, there's a British Academy, and I'm embarrassed by the things and achievements that I left out in that introduction, but I'd use up all the time. And also I haven't even get round to talking about all the wonderful records, performances that I've been privileged to own, experience, and be in the audience. And it's always a great pleasure to welcome you, to talk to you, and just simply to be in your company is incredibly inspiring. So welcome back to Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival. And George is joined by Mariam Rezaei, who's a composer, performer, DJ and improviser. She's a musical director of Noistra, a turntable ensemble of young people, and the musical director of Northern Proud Voices, an LGBT choir based in Newcastle. Mariam's also a lecturer in music technology and composition at Newcastle University. And amongst the many composition achievements, one of my favourite has to be ANX, commissioned for Tectonics Glasgow, for members of the BBC, SSO and Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra in, I think, 2014, if my memory is right. And last year at HCMF, Mariam presented a solo work, Wolf's Tale, which was commissioned by the festival and had an amazing positive response, both from peers and critics. And a little bit of a preview, a little bit of a heads up for anyone out there who's tuning in. Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival will commission a large scale work from Mariam to be premiered in 2022. Mariam Rezaei, welcome. It's great to see you as well, as always. And I'm very much looking forward now to seeing where both of you take the conversation. And I'm going to join the audience out there, remove myself from the screen and listen intently. So thank you both very, very much. And I'll see you in about 45 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. George.
Oh, here we are. And we're meeting just now for the first time.
This is extraordinary. It's just amazing that I'm able to do this. And I want to ask you, because I heard a little bit before about the amazing background that you have.
That comes from being old.
Sorry?
Comes from being old. You're old enough and you end up doing a lot of stuff.
Can you tell me about the Zoom background that you have?
Oh, yeah. This is a piece, I'm going to get out of the way so I can show you. This is a piece that I have written about and continue to come back to. It's called Jam-Packed Jelly Type for Jamila. It's made by the painter Jeff Donaldson, who was one of the founders of the Afro-Cobra movement. It started out as Cobra, and Cobra was called Coalition of Black Revolutionary Artists. And it wasn't just painters, there were filmmakers, there were musicians, there were all kinds of people. Around the founding of the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, Muhal and Abrams, who was the founder of that organization, was also part of Cobra. And you see him there if you look very carefully in the center of the picture. And you also see James Brown and Charles Clark, the bassist, who was an early AACM person. You know, the thing about this picture, just to tell you, these artists, they went to like standard art schools, and the standard art schools were sort of telling them that there was sort of a moral imperative about, let's say, color field painting. So in other words, something like Rothko, that was considered the way to do it, and you had to all emulate that. And these people were thinking, we don't see how these sort of gradual color washes have anything to do with our experience both in Chicago, the African American community, the trans-African community they were trying to begin. So they were trying to, align themselves with. So they started thinking, well, let's have as many colors as possible. Let's fill up as much of the space that we possibly can. And they were very influenced in that by who else? John Coltrane. So if you look at a picture like this and you listen to it, you're like, Coltrane, you get the picture. Beyond that, I associate it with timbre. So someone like Roscoe Mitchell, or any sort of idea where you've got, they used to call their work, they said, we want to take a particular kind of color, and we call them Kool-Aid colors, So, and there are a lot of them. There's Barbara Jones Hogu, Jay Jarrell, Wadsworth Jarrell, and other people. And this idea of Kool-Aid colors was very deliberately connected with both commercial culture, but not pop art, but also with what people were experiencing in their everyday lives. So that's I don't know. I like this background. I've thought about this painting. I keep coming back to it. I mean, are you a big art head? I mean, I'm not really, but I know a little bit.
I'm not, no. I wish I was. I wish I knew more. I think I wish I knew more about everything. I think the older I get, the more I realize I don't know much. And there's so much more to constantly learn. But it's just such a stunning background, and it has such a lovely story behind it, and your explanation. So I just wanted to ask you about it.
Well, here's something I heard, because I was watching a lot of these videos, and I see we've been hanging out with some of the same people, like Elon Volkov, and
Oh yeah.
I don't know if he liked what I said. I said this on the BBC radio. I said, cheerful post-genre radical. I mean,
yeah.
You think that works? I thought it worked pretty good. He looked at me a little funny when I said that, because I didn't tell him in advance I was going to say that. But what did you do with him? What was that?
Oh, I've been commissioned a couple of times by Elan for tectonics festivals over the years. So to write smaller pieces with turntables, smaller pieces with other instrumental ensembles, to deliver some workshops.
Oh, okay.
Work, which I'm really keen on, working with a lot of graphic and text scores. And then I've written larger pieces. So I had written a piece, Anks, for Tectonics in Glasgow a few years ago, which was with the Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra.
Ah, my favorites.
They're amazing. They're amazing. So they're more mutual friends, Raymond MacDonald and George Burt, and oh yeah.
Absolutely, George Burt, forget it. He made this T-shirt for my son, which he wore for years. It was like a score. And my son is kind of a musician himself, Oh, and George we did this piece a couple of years ago with Tam Dean Byrne, the actor. That was incredible. I mean, I've had a lot of great experience with them. In fact, we're doing a similar conversation next week with Raymond and Tia Denora. And so the sociologist of music. And so, yeah, Graham went to this. I mean, like Raymond, that's incredible. God, it's great. I don't know. But anyway, there's something to think about. So so you've done that as well. That's you work with them. It said also you work with Ensemble Modern, which is amazing also.
Oh, well, it's amazing for It is. It's amazing. I was going to ask you about that because I saw your conference recently, which is,
Oh.
but yeah, I wrote a piece called TOPH, which was for improvising conductor, improvising turntables, and improvising ensemble, and it was
Mhm.
a lot of fun. A lot went wrong, and a lot went right.
Well,
But
what could go wrong? I mean, like, I don't know how do you make a piece for turntables and ensemble anyway? How do you do it?
well, this is a very good question. I don't know if I can answer it because I'm still trying to. I think I'm trying to work out exactly how can you do that. And I think it's about communication. And for me, I've decided certainly with this piece for Ensemble Modern was to try and find the communication using Ilan as the conductor because he's so
Hmm.
great at improvising. I saw him uh, improvise as a conductor, working with the Necks in the BBC SSO at Tectonics Glasgow quite a few years ago, and that was that definitely inspired me. Um, but when I had written the piece and when we got into rehearsals, I kind of started to realize what I needed more of or less of, or how I perhaps needed to push myself more to push the other musicians in a different direction. Um, it feels like it's a long learning journey. I don't think it's answered yet. How do you?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of these things where I guess when we think about this, I mean, there's the ensemble daring people. Do they have a score, or what were they being asked to do?
Yeah, they had a very simple score of a few musical ideas that were numbered, and I worked out a system for signalling from Ilan, but also to give him some space to improvise within that, so he could change ideas or choose different pictures. Um, I had chosen specific timbres and sounds with the turntables, and designed a couple of different structures. So there was a sort of question and answer, antiphonal structure. There was more of a free improvised structure based on oscillators on 4 turntables at the same time. And then there was a general free improv, which
Hmm.
I wanted to just see, can it really be done? And it can be. It can be. It was quite stressful for everybody involved. But in the end, Ilan told me, yes, it was okay. So I think it went all right.
Well, congratulations, because there's a lot of risk involved in that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you've worked with an incredible number of performers and collaborators and improvisers over the years. And um, I recently picked up the Rainbow Family release.
You did? Wow.
Yeah, well, it's fantastic. There's a lot of jazz and a lot of in my life and lots of crazy experimental music. And
Mhm.
when Graham mentioned the possibility of having a conversation with you, I jumped down his throat. Bless him. Yes, I will do that. I would love to talk with George, please. And I think there's some fantastic. I mean, you've done so much, but along the way, you've also experimented in so many different ways, and I think you talk very openly about lots of lessons that you've learned in terms of music, and then socially, things that have changed and things that you've experienced. So you described Rainbow Family, um,
Hmm.
drawing from early 80s AI, 1950s cybernetics, and social musical networks of free improv, and creating a social aesthetic that included creative machines as central actors. And I think it's wonderful in its complexity. And I was hoping you could explain a little bit more to me about exactly what you were doing at AACM and what was happening in these recordings.
What was I doing at IRCOM? I was coming of age. I was 30 years old, or just about 30 years old in 1982 when I got there. And I didn't speak French. And, and I didn't know about any of those people. Uh, I came from a different world of experimental music. And in fact, when I started being involved in experimental music through the AACM, we weren't considered experimental music. That was because of the people who were writing the articles then, who were doing the histories. We were off in this sort of segregated space where if you picked up a book and we were in it, all the Black people were on one page. And so, so around about 2008, that was the reason for me titling my book, the AACM and American Experimental Music, because that's what it was. But we needed a new definition or a new identity for American experimental music, which included a much more inclusive definition, which of course included Afro-diasporic artists, and so which heretofore have been kind of left out. So 700 pages later, I got my licks in. So on that book, with that book. But anyway, about Rainbow Family, you know, there were a group of us who were working on trying to do interactivity with machines. I first encountered the League of Automatic Music Composers in 1977 or so. And they had their computers, they were like single board computers, like 1,000 bytes of memory, very primitive in those terms, but very sophisticated, smart ideas. You know, Rich Gold and John Bischoff and Tim Perkis, and who else is in there? Jim Horton, who passed away, and David Berman was teaching there at Mills at the time, and Jacques Bécard, the Belgian composer. And so I was watching these people in the rehearsals, their computers, they were just sitting back and listening to them play. They weren't pushing any buttons or doing anything. And I said, wow, this sounded great. It sounded like people improvising, which of course, in a way it was. They were kind of, these computers were kind of improvising. That's what I would say today. But I said, I got to get one of these. So I started off by trying to do something akin to what they were doing, but then I quickly decided that I could also do something akin to what I was doing. So what if I could, you know, put a computer on stage with, I don't know, Roscoe Mitchell or Muhal or Abrams or somebody. So when I got to IRCOM, that was kind of the idea, was to make a piece for improvisers and interactive computers. And, you know, it took a while to write the software and to get everything going. And then we put the piece on. And that, what you heard, the CD, you know, I don't think many people were doing this kind of thing quite like that in '82. It sounded sort of like an improvising orchestra, which I've been trying to do with computers for a long time, because I'm interested in these ideas about, you know, what happens in large groups in terms around communication. And it's already interesting when you have a lot of players. Then you have a lot of players and a lot of computers. That ends up being even more challenging. So that's what that CD is really about. I mean, all the recordings from 1984 was like 30 some years ago we were doing this. And then came along something called Voyager, which some people maybe know more about. But this was pre-Voyager, and a lot of the issues that were tackled there in Voyager began with this. And also 4 years before with this older piece that is not on record called Chamber Music for Humans and Non-Humans. So I've been doing that an awfully long time, and so on. but you know, I was interested in a way because I heard you know, I got a chance to, you sent me these wonderful links. I got a chance to check a lot of things out. And so I heard on a video that you met Rodri Davis, and he sort of like was a big, I can imagine him being very helpful, but so that what happened there? That was exciting, you know?
I'm very fortunate to know Rodri. So I was studying for my master's, excuse me, at Durham University, and I was working with a couple of other postgrads, and we were just having an improv, you know, just let us have a jam. We were all sat in the hall having a jam, and typical Northern English weather, you know, it's drizzly outside, it's pretty dark, and it was a little bit, it's almost like, you know, the setup for a horror film.
Are you from the North, or where are you from?
I am. I'm from the North.
You got the sound. You got the Northern sound.
and so I'm rehearsing with a couple of friends, And you know, we've got all sorts of weird instruments out, and I've got my turntables, and we're just playing. And there's a knock on the door to the department, and we go answer it because it's a small department. And it's this guy wearing a big jacket, and he's absolutely drenched. And he comes to the West of rehearse, and he goes, "Hi, I've just moved up to Newcastle, and I play the harp, and I'm just looking for some people to improvise and to just say hello and just to say I'm here now. My wife's working at the geography department, and so what's happening in Durham?"
Really? Wow.
Yeah, I'm like, here's this wet harvest that's coming. And he came straight over, and he's like, "Yeah, have you heard of Otomo Yoshihide?" And I hadn't. I came very much from a hip hop background. I was like, "No, I'm Cuba. Like, who's this he's talking about?" And he'd just come off tour from working with Otomo Yoshihide, and I was like, "Okay, yeah." And then, you know, he came back, I think, a couple of weeks later, and we all had a jam together. And the next thing I know, I got asked to come and play a couple of informal gigs in the city, which turns out to be his legendary series of house concerts. Beautiful. And just from there, really, I was very fortunate that I met Rodri, and in such a lovely way. He's been a huge, very positive influence and a mentor, unofficially a mentor, that supported me in so many different ways. You know?
Well, that's extremely lucky. I mean, I've only met him a couple of times, but I can, you know, I see the effect that he's had on so many people, including me in terms of the music. But I mean, just it's great that you got a chance to meet him so closely, because I was listening to some of these recordings. Like there was another one. It was Tusk Virtual, I think it was called, Stephen Bishop. I didn't know anything about. And I heard, you know, where do you get your sounds? Because I thought I heard like one of those, a sound that sounded like the what do they call it? The transporter in Star Trek. You didn't hear that one? Maybe he made that sound. I mean, it was sort of, because, you know, being my dad and my mom and sister watch Star Trek all the time, and, you know, or I heard other sounds that sounded like vuvuzelas going and going. I mean, where you? But you have to. The sounds come from the records, right? So in your case, or?
Yeah. So I use a digital vinyl system, which is called Track.
Oh, so you don't have to get physical stuff.
No, I mean, I do use a real record, but on the record, it's just a sine tone that's played. I use a DJ mixer. That's a sound card that connects the record decks with software on my laptop. So I'm able to drop any sound I want essentially onto a record. So it's just, yeah, the movement of the record is read through the computer. The latency is very small, which is very good now. It's a system that's been around for quite a while, and for me has been very liberating, because it means I can just make a sound very quickly on my phone, airdrop, and boom, done, ready. You know, and I've had situations in gigs where I've asked someone, "Oh, just sing it in your phone, just airdrop it on my," you know, and then I'm able to play, you know, just 2 minutes ahead of doing an improv, something that they've just decided, "Oh, can we try and work with?" And
it's kind of like those old things where they would, like Mozart would say, sing a theme. Somebody would sing something to the audience, and then he would improvise on it. So you can do that.
Yeah. And the performance I had with Stephen Bishop. So Stephen Bishop's a very interesting musician. He's also he also runs Opal Tapes, which is a really amazing electronic music record label. He puts out music from artists all over the world, just absolutely fantastic stuff. Stephen himself is an incredible musician. And for Tusk Virtual this year, I was paired with Stephen, who is a Geordie. He's from Newcastle, and he's very close by. He's nearby, and we've worked together putting gigs on, but we never performed before. So I asked Stephen if he could just send me some sounds, doesn't matter what, just send me some stuff so I can have a mess around. And then when we met, we just had a jam. I suppose I'm quite interested in the challenge of a sound, being posed a sound. What can you make from this sound?
Mhm.
And I think the turntables, because they're so tactile and because of the way that I use them and physically and I handle the vinyl and also include scratching and beat juggling, changing pitch for like different tones. And then there's some couple of extra bells, I suppose, and whistles on some of the software for looping and effects. You can still find a completely new sound from a new sound. So there's this huge element of surprise in improvising with turntables, but you know what the source material is, but once it's in motion, you kind of you don't. It could be really disappointing. It could be completely alien and magnificent. You know what I mean? And very exciting. So yeah, so I like to ask people to give me sounds because that in itself is a challenge. And so I was lucky that Stephen sent me stuff. I have no idea about Star Trek, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, maybe he sent you this. Maybe that was one of the sounds he sent you, because I definitely heard it.
So everyone thinks I'm in Star Trek.
I could tell you, I could show you exactly on the later we can chat, and I can show you, I noted the time. I said, well, this is just to document that, you know. But well, let me ask you this, because this is something, you know, because now you are lecturing in music technology, you know, and everything. But did you start out like, I mean, it doesn't seem to me that turntabling is something you learn in academic school, although they do have books on it now.
They do.
But I mean, like, did you learn from a book, or how did you learn music technology? How did it start for you?
Well, you know, I learned to play the piano from a very young age, and I was very serious about performing until I was about 14. You know, I got
Okay.
through all the grades and stuff and studied with my piano teachers very hard. I decided when I was at school, I saw I had had friends that were DJing, and I decided I wanted some turntables.
Hmm.
My mom and dad were very much, you know, you've had your 10 years of piano lessons, you should be playing the piano. It's wildly different from playing classical and your Bach and your Fauré and Shostakovich to I want to be a hip hop DJ, Missy Elliott mum. You know? So that was wildly different. And I kind of had to teach myself at the same time as, you know, learning along with friends, you know, about how to DJ. But I remember seeing DJ David playing on the DMCs on MTV Base on the TV, and it was just you know, it was actually very gimmicky and it's very cringy to think about now, but he was doing headstands and putting Coke cans and turntables on top of them, and it was very much a gimmick. But at 15, I'd never seen anything like that. And I was like, okay, so he just was doing that. Okay. And so I became very curious and started to learn more. I suppose getting a hold of videos and talking with friends and trying, and yeah, a lot of experimenting with the unknown, because this was pre-YouTube as well. So I didn't really have that kind of stuff going on. It wasn't so easy to get a hold of stuff online. So a lot of VHS and cassette tapes being copied and shared around with friends.
Yeah, but then the thing is, you have to learn the hardware and the software and all of that. I mean, you know, in my case, you know, I'm pretty much self-taught in that way. You know, artists were teaching themselves computer programming. So, and when we were doing it, you know, people, the word byte, you know, was not in the dictionary. And so you couldn't just go to a store and get a book on how to program this to that. So
Yeah.
it was really like oral narratives. You know, you would talk to somebody and they'd say, well, here's how you do this, or it's, you know, in my case, David Berriman helped me out quite a bit. We worked together on a number of projects, but when I first started, it was like the single board computer came with these 3 books. There was a hardware book, which basically said, well, here's how the hardware works, and And here's a power supply, because it didn't come with a power supply. Here's a schematic for a simple power supply that you could build. And I never built anything. But my dad used to work on radio and stuff, but he never got a job. He never got a job doing it. He worked for the post office for most of his life. But I was like 5 years old, and he would, he didn't have anybody to talk to about this stuff. So he would, tell me about Ohm's law, E equals IR. I said, well, what is that, And he'd show these schematics, and this is a capacitor, and this is a resistor, and what is it, Then I'm looking at the schematic. I'm like 25 years old. I'm thinking, well, wow, I know what this is. I think I am going to be able to build this thing. And so I built it and I showed him. So it was pretty cool. But anyway, and then there's the programming book, which had words like bit and byte that I had never heard of, right? I said, this byte is 8 bits. Duh, what? And it had sample programs, and then you had to ask somebody. You couldn't just do it by yourself. So, and then I never got good at a lot of it. I'm still horrible with mixers. I pre-fader, post-fader, I mean, like, I'm just good at the parts I'm good at, and that's it. And, but I never tried to be like I taught Max for a while. I really got into the 4th programming language. That was wonderful. I could do anything in that. I felt just procedural language, arrays, matrices, all this, it was, and then they had this weird, what do they call it? Postfix notation or reverse Polish notation. That seemed like a breeze to me. It was like speaking German. You do the data and then you have the verb and you run it, So, but, in terms of like, that's what's happening to a lot of people. Now you're teaching people.
Yeah.
And this gets to a very interesting point, which is, I read an article by my old friend, Georgina Bourne, who I guess is now Dame Georgina Bourne. And she wrote this famous book on earcom, which was written about the same time as the Rainbow Family thing. That's a great book if you haven't seen it. It's called Rationalizing Culture. And she wrote an article about the teaching of music technology in Britain. I don't know if you've seen this, but part of the article is about the difficulties in terms of gender and ethnicity and finding people, particularly women and people of color, in terms of getting them into the composition teaching, which is something I experienced here in the United States as well. I mean, what kind of experience have you had with that? Is it diversities of these kinds, I guess?
I mean, it's quite a difficult, it's quite a difficult subject. I mean, even now, I find that I'm in a professional situation and I'm patronized for being a woman.
Sure.
Last year, actually, I was very surprised. Sometimes you forget, things get much better for a while, and then there'll be this one slamming incident, and you just kind of go, oh yeah, of course, I wouldn't know I'm a woman. I turned up to my own performance, and the sound engineer was like, so you know how to use this? I was like, it's my mixer. And I like to set my turntables a particular way, which you might see behind I have them battle style, because it just means you have more surface area on the record, without knocking the tone on. And I'd set it all up, and then I'd gone away to the loo or something, I'd come back, and he'd moved them. And I says, as I turned them back round, he went, no, it goes round this way. And I just, do you know what? So I just left it, and then as I was getting ready to perform, I turned them back round, did my thing, and then afterwards he came up to me and went, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Would you like to get a drink? I was thinking, no.
No, we're not having that.
No. Sorry. But like, can you just leave my stuff? But yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of different things along the way, and sometimes you think, is this going to get better, or is it getting better? But I suppose we both have very different experiences. We have very different heritages, and it is something.
What you said, I recognize it totally. I've had exactly the same experiences, and very much so. I mean, frequently asked question for a good 25 years. I would give lectures on Voyager, or we give a concert. And the first question would come out of the audience, and I'd be standing with all my white colleagues who were doing similar things. They'd say, well, did you build it yourself? That was the question number one. And then at sound checks, there would be all this moment where I would have this, we'd have the technical writer, we have all the information, you know, I'd send it in. And, you know, the engineer would start asking me these questions. And I'd say, well, what do these questions have to do with getting the sound to work? And I realized he was testing me to see if I knew anything about the equipment or how it worked or the software or anything. And so I just got to the stage where I just said, well, you know, I really don't have time to explain how the software works, but because we really have to get ready for the concert. But I didn't leave open the possibility of getting a beer afterwards, since I already knew that I wasn't going to want to do that, you know. But you know, I'm not surprised to find that this is an ongoing issue. It's endemic to the field. But what are we going to do about it? It seems to me that, like in terms of the teaching, you know, as Georgina Bourne's article said, talked about the numbers are very low, so how does one increase them? And one of the things I thought you were doing, or I assumed somehow that doing these workshops was one way to initiate more people, these kinds of diversities.
Yeah, I think giving a lot of workshops. I'm very keen on, you know, supporting in the sort of informal mentoring as well, and encouraging people that I do meet through workshops. I help run a series of small concerts up in Newcastle with a project that I have called the Old Police House.
Mm-hmm.
And given that it's the northeast of England, the diversity in the community is quite limited as well.
Mm.
And that's just the nature geographically of where I am. But I was very fortunate, and I have learned, going back to talking about Roger Davis, I've learned a great deal about the power and the influence and the support that you can give as someone mentoring, even just informally. And that's something that I always want to try and help encourage in the Northeast with people from all different backgrounds, you know. And one of the things that we do at the Old Police House project is help encourage by just offering space, sharing equipment. As a collective, like there's only a handful of us who work together as a collective of artists, but you know, between us we've had this one sound card and it's done the rounds and worked very hard for several years, you know. But it's how we help enable each other to do better and to progress artistically, but also to help share and platform others. I mean, I teach DJing and turntablism as part of my work at Newcastle University, and I think, you know, it's part of the conversation along the way has been, is DJing really an art form? Is it really an instrument? Is it really going to work in academia? And for the first year running that course, I had an incredible number of students who would turn up 9 a.m. midweek to get straight into making big mixes, lectures on turntablism, hardcore nerdy, you know, DJ stuff and details, and listen to some hard mixes that have been, you know, recorded at 4 a.m. at 9 a.m., you know, with their cups of coffee and their hoodies on. And there's some real dedication. I think it's been worth having the conversations with a number of different academics and musicians, and taking the risk and saying, yes, this is important. It shouldn't be being lost. But also, for me, teaching DJing at university, sharing those skills in workshops, the Police House project, all of those different things, to help ensure that new music is facilitated up here, but also turntablism will still survive and will thrive. We have a new group of DJs in Newcastle now.
Wow.
So,
well, you guys have a great scene over there, as far as I can see, just looking at the list of cool people, some of whom I have known for years, like Paul Adnello and people like that, and Nanette DeJoy.
oh yeah.
You know, I mean, incredible group. But and among others, there's a bunch of them actually. But I was interested in this partly because I have a similar background in that way as well. I mean, when I came to the AACM, I came through the school. They had a school, right? They started the school in 1968 when I did the research for the book. They taped a lot of their meetings. And so you could hear what they were saying. And so one of the meetings was about starting the school. And so this was years of, like 3 years of like tapes of meetings. And one of the meetings where I started the school, then you hear Muhal and Abrams on there saying, well, we should start a school, but we don't want to have it be about so-called teachers and so-called students. That's not what we want. We want, just sort of like more collaborative notion of what the school was like. So that was 1967. So by the time I got there in 71, it was all done. It didn't cost anything. People got up early in the morning. They all got their classes started at 9 a.m. and there were classes in composition. There were no classes. There were classes in instrumental music. I didn't take those. I took the class in composition, and there were no classes in improvisation or anything like that. So basically, they were teaching you to be composers because that was the thing that it was sort of thought that, well, maybe either there aren't any Black composers, or maybe there shouldn't be, or you guys should be doing something else but not composing. And so all these people have been kind of told that most of their lives, despite their backgrounds, despite the types of things they've been involved in, and despite the music. Certain kinds of infrastructures were being denied. So the greatest infrastructure is just basic knowledge of what's going on in the field. So I got a lot of that from just sitting in those lectures and writing things down. They had you composing on the first day. So when you composed a piece immediately, and then you had to bring back an elaborate version of the piece you did next week. So those were my first composition lessons. In a way, they were the only ones that really made a difference. And so the power of those workshops to deal with the community you're in, to produce something new and to sort of, and then the other thing is, now that you have this sort of academic thing, you can leverage that too. One of the things I noticed when I got to Columbia, being the first and still the only African-American professor ever hired there in music, 120 years, was that that problem was sort of ongoing. So what are we going to do about it, and how can we leverage the resources of the institutions to do the kind of things we wanted to do? At the job I had before, I noticed that one of my colleagues was working on a really great book, which became Elements of Computer Music, which is a classic in the field, and F. Richard Moore. And Dick said, well, I work on this. Who knows who really needs it? But it's something I feel is needed. And so the institution gives me the resources to work on it. I said, okay, well, I guess I could do that. What could I do? Well, maybe I could start documenting the community I'm in, or something like that. You could look at it in a much more self-centered way. Like, I could use this to get my work out, or to, get more compositions performed or whatever. But then maybe you look and you see, well, who else can we include here? How far can this go? How can we leverage the resource institution to help other people? Maybe get other people into the institution, or maybe get ways for that knowledge and brain trust to come out. Maybe enlist other people who to help out. And then we noticed that, back to this thing about like you talked about, the gender issue. If you look around we did this thing in Darmstadt in 2018. In 2016, Georgina and Ash Furig did this amazing research where they discovered that, of course, there were hardly any women being, programmed or as teachers in there. It was a very low percentage. And, I didn't have to do a lot of research to find out that there are only 3 African Americans, or Afro-diasporic people, not just African Americans, but Afro-diasporic composers in the whole history of the thing. That didn't take much research. So, so what do you do in those circumstances? How do you leverage those resources? How do you change the discourse? And if you do, then see, because what happens is that the field becomes addicted to these kinds of exclusions. And that addiction is like any other. It impoverishes you, it impoverishes the field, and maybe it even kills you. So at a certain point, the smart people leave because they don't see any future. And you're left with the dregs, the people that don't see any problem with all the exclusions. You know, the dummies. And so that destroys the field. So in order to save the field that you're a part of, you must do these things. And so we were able at Columbia to gradually achieve, like, you know, gender balance in the graduate student competition cohort, and sort of really enhance the number of people of color that were a part of it as well, and to sort of think hard about maintaining that, you know, and to drop a lot of the presuppositions that kept that from happening, because it's a matter of the survival of the field that we're in, you know. And that's why I was wondering, like, you were talking about being involved in experimental music. I mean, it seems to me that if we had like a situation in which universities, you know, because I think it starts even earlier. Like, I read this wonderful book, Music, Gender, Education by Lucy Green. I think it's based on the UK experience. And she said that what happened is that girls and boys started out at basically equal numbers in the music schools and the music instruction, and then the number of girls starts to drop off and drop off and drop off. So by the time you get to post-secondary stuff, there's hardly anyone there, any women, right?
Yeah.
So it has to start very early, but at a certain point, you can't wait for that. And so you have to take steps now to take that field, which has been artificially and probably deliberately diminished, and you sort of expand that, like the way you would, you know, like one of those audio expanders. And then you kind of say, well, let's make it, if everyone started doing that, in 10 years' time, you wouldn't have this issue anymore, where, as it was for me when I used to walk into those experimental music places in the 70s, people, all the heads would turn, what is this guy doing here? Because at the time, it was either me or Julius Eastman, and nobody knew who I was, so. But even there, even when Julius came in, who is that, you know? So I don't know. I mean, it seems like you're taking steps to deal with that, but at the same time, it looks like you're also experiencing, maybe even in experimental music, maybe there's more work to be done there.
I think there's, well, I actually have a very similar question for you about the AACM. I think there is more work to be done, but I think we're very fortunate to have people like Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival. We've got Graham McKenzie, we have Ilan Volkov. Certainly, you know, based in the UK, we have programmers like Lee Etherington at Tusk, Hope and Alistair Campbell for Count Flows, and Cafe Otto, who are very conscious and make a very, I think, a very balanced program and continually work to curate something. I think one thing that I'm very keen to see, and I know they all do, is they work with programs and put programs that are specific for different very diverse groups. At the same time, the regular programming is also diverse, because I don't know if you agree or what, I don't know if there is a real solution, but how do we make sure that programming becomes more diverse more naturally? At the same time, we also need to, in looking at it equitably, need to offer more opportunities for diverse groups of performers to come to the forefront. So I feel like there needs to, I don't know if you agree, but I feel like we need a balance between dedicated programs and continuing within regular programming until regular is naturally diverse and more balanced. I'm kind of putting the words in your mouth there, George.
Well, no, I mean, like that is one of the issues. I have been concentrating on, I saw a huge hole in the programming and historiography of experimental music and also classical music in terms of the absence or the near absence of the Afro-diasporic element. And I've written about this, and it seems to be an exceptional absence. For example, it's not just something that I have no reason, I don't know how it occurred, but the numbers over the decades, and when you are not revealing, and I remember I was we had a conference in Darmstadt in 2018, and a person came, it was a very nice book, and but it didn't have any Black people in it. And I said, well, what happened there? Where did they go? And it was a very interesting answer. I mean, it was partly that when he went to school, no one talked about that, so he didn't include it in his book. And so, but the thing is, that's not much of an excuse, but I think it got better later with him in the book, but or maybe there'll be a second edition coming. But from what I saw, I was seeing programs of Polish music or French music or German music or any other kind of music, except, in terms of classical music production, but no Afro-diasporic concerts ever. And no one on the programs at all, maybe one or two people and I'm looking at this huge group of neglected people. And so I'm saying, well, what's the reason why they're neglected? Who cares? Let's just get them out there. Let's just focus on that for a while. And I'd say both are required because we're still going to have concerts of French music and German music and all that. So there's no reason not to have targeted concerts.
Yeah.
At the same time, like as you say, the other kinds of diversities, the one where you have like mixed programs, because they're not that mixed. I mean, everyone is just doing something within the tradition or whatever it is, or extending the tradition or doing something. So if they're going to think, but I don't think these things happen naturally. I think they happen because someone wants them to happen. And when they're exclusions, you can bet that these are not deliberate, but it's more of a question that they look at certain people and they say, well, these people aren't members of the tribe, or they're not subject to the discourse, or maybe there's something exceptional about them, or something like that. They don't think these people are somehow even present. As one of my former students, Dana Reason, the musicologist, wrote, she coined this term, the myth of absence, but she coined it for experimental women improvisers. And so the idea was she did all this research and found out that basically the common thing that we say, well, people would say, well, how come there are no women here? And they say, we couldn't find anybody. In other words, they don't exist, So that myth of absence is very pervasive. And sometimes the only way to combat the myth of absence is to present a radical presence.
Yeah, and I think also to actively research to make sure you are, as someone who programs work, I think we have a responsibility to our audiences as well as to the artists to keep actively researching. And I feel like I only work with very small gigs and small programs, so I don't have the experience of running huge festivals. But I kind of feel responsible to the audience if I haven't made sure that I've really looked as far and as wide as reach as possible. I wanted to ask you about the AACM. I mean, I know of musicians who really have come forth and are doing very well now, who are very much in the contemporary programming that I'm seeing, like Nicole Mitchell, Martina Roberts, Tishon Sori, and Mike Reed. And I understand that they've come through the AACM school.
Or somehow been influenced by it. Tishon is more of an influence of it. Nicole was the president of the AACM. She was the first woman to be the president. And Tamika Reed, there are people in this generation, yeah.
Moving forward in the way that we hope that programming will work. Do you feel like the AACM is still going to be relevant in the future, or is it relevant now more than ever?
Well, you know, it's a funny thing about the AACM. Well, the AACM is now, what, it's 2020? So what is it, 55 years old? Is that right? Okay. So the AACM has had enormous generational change and shift. You know, all of the people who started have passed away. The second generation, like me, is pretty old. There's a third, the fourth generation. So as long as I think there's a need for people to come together to find ways to change their situation, there will be a need for, if not the AACM, the idea of something like an AACM, which didn't exist before these people came up with it. And they came up with it because there was a need to serve especially African American people, but the Afro-diasporic aspect of music, providing an atmosphere in which people could feel supported to create what they created. The thing about the AACM was it was totally non-critical. I mean, no one ever told you your work was bad. They would always tell you it was good. And I'm sure a lot of my work was terrible, but they would never say this. They would just say, keep doing it or just do something, because people didn't need that. The whole rest of the planet was telling them their work was bad, that their stuff was worthless, that, you know, Black people didn't do stuff like that, all that kind of stuff. So they didn't need anybody else saying the work, you know, they just needed you to step out and try to do things. So that kind of support I try to give to people now. You know, I take the same attitude in my graduate student teaching and anyone. You can't get a quote from me about don't ask me about the quality of your work. I'm not going to tell you. I'm just going to say, well, you know, just keep working on it and something will come out of it.
I want to ask you a completely different swerve ball question. I know that you've worked with turntablists in the past.
That's true. DJ Mutamasic, Marina Rosenfeld, just those two mainly.
I wanted to ask you about how you found working with them and collaborating with turntables. As a turntablist, it's always interesting to talk to other musicians and how they feel it is working and interacting with turntables.
You know, it's a funny thing because, you know, I made a turntable record with Marina. It's called Sour Mash. It comes on vinyl. And so Marina, since I didn't know anything about, I worked with Mutamasic before, but I didn't really understand what she was doing. I understand what she was doing sonically. It's brilliant, right? And she had all this influence with Sound Lab. She worked with them and all this sort of Egyptian stuff and Halim El Dab and these kinds of people. And so, and her husband, Morgan Kraft, a great guitarist and so on. There was a lot of stuff there to deal with. So we made a recording together called Sequel. It's on Intact Records from 2004. And with Marina, it was more like she, you know, I didn't really, you know, you guys always have two turntables, right? You don't never just have one, or maybe, I don't know if you
All of us have more than two, you know, Joe.
Yes, yeah. In fact, sometimes I don't really know how. I only saw Marina with two. Maybe she has more. And then sometimes, what we had to do is, in order to make the recording was on one vinyl record with two sides, but in order to play both sides, you had to have two turntables, one for each record. So, and then the other thing was, we made it so that one side was sort of basically more, my music would be more featured, and the other side, her music would be more featured. And then, but it was organized so that the gaps in one would fit into the other. So it was like one jigsaw puzzle. So when you listen to both of them together, they would all fit into one big composition. So there were three compositions in one. And it took us a month to make this in the studio, or maybe more, at Harvest Works in New York. It's wonderful, you know, Carol Parkinson's great place. And she did performances with 8 turntablists, like giant groups, Martin Tetro, who I never even met, and people like this. And so I would say that for me, that was, I learned a great deal from that, but I've also improvised with her in more intimate settings with just the two of us. And since I'm not a turntablist, but I still want to work with sounds, I sort of use Ableton Live for that. I worked with a group called 48 Nord, and there's just two people, a duo, and they got me back into live performance electronics, which I hadn't done for years. I'd just been doing like, Voyager type performances where I improvise with the computer, or the computers improvise by themselves or with other people, but not for years, personal performance, because I was never really as good as that at that as people like, Richard Teitelbaum, great mentors like that. So that got me back into it. So I feel better now about being able to do that. But so I think in a way, working with turntablists brought me to that understanding that I could come back into the performance of electronic music.
Yeah, we're very handsy. We like to touch things and do it live.
Yeah, yeah. And I see Graham here. He's getting ready to.
Yeah, I'm very sorry, because I could listen to you both talking for a long time, and it's one of the things that's very difficult with this. We had the idea that we would do light touch moderation, and of course now I just want to ask both of you lots of questions, and we could keep it going for another hour based on some of the things you've said. But we've run out of time, as you do always at these things in a festival where we've got limited time and we're on to the next event. So it really just remains for me to thank you both for a fascinating talk. Mariam Rezaei, thank you very much, and George Lewis. It's been fascinating to listen to you both talk, some of the common interests that you have, some of the people that you've worked with and encountered as well, and a good place to end talking about George and working with turntablists, because as I've been sitting listening to you, it struck me that actually next time I have to get you both on the stage to perform together at HCMF, a future edition, and I will make that happen. That would be a fascinating evening of music, I think. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.